Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the professor, and this is the moment of truth. I had originally said that my little series on reparations was going to be 3 parts. I decided that I would put an epilogue on it. A large number of people in the comments have been noting that the government owes reparations above all others, and you're absolutely right. And although the government's responsibility for and involvement in the slave trade goes without saying, nonetheless, it must be said. And when I say government, I'm not just talking about the U.S. government. I already told you about how you had states like the state of Louisiana that owned black people under their Department of Public Works in the early 19th century. So when we say government, we're talking about city, county, state, and federal. Because the states and a large number of cities also had their own laws and statutes and codes and ordinances that made it where they not merely enforced slavery but also profited from it. I mention that because I think there's a lot of people who downplay the importance, the significance, or even the necessity of making sure that individual states also have to be put on the hook for reparations to fight for them at the state level. But keep in mind, it was the states who were enforcing slavery and benefited from it directly, so they're as responsible as the federal government. However, we do focus on the federal government because Congress has the power of the purse. The states can try to play the game of economic keep away by screaming, we just don't have the money, we don't have the ability to print our own money, so we just don't have it. The federal government, however, cannot. Now, we know that the U.S. federal government paid to make sure that black people were forced to build the White House and the Capitol building, among other landmarks in D.C. The overwhelming majority of America's first presidents owned slaves. We're talking about heads of government, and they owned slaves while they were in office, while they were in the White House, they did this. And that number becomes even greater if you count the presidents who had owned slaves at some point in their lives, including Ulysses S. Grant. As I've always told you, anti-black racism has always had bipartisan support. But the U.S. government's crimes against us did not end in 1865. When they passed the 13th Amendment, they left in a slavery loophole. All you have to do is look at the wording of the 13th Amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime. That word except nullifies everything that came before it in the sentence. This is as blatant an admission as you could possibly get that the U.S. government's declared. John Q. Citizen can no longer own slaves, but Uncle Sam can. And Uncle Sam has, and they've also extended that to the powers of the state. The state and local governments could do the same thing. Slavery went from being a private sector institution to a public sector one. This is a distinction without a difference. It becomes even more so when you look at the fact that it says, unless you've been duly convicted. Yeah, but who are the ones who actually prosecute the cases? Who are the judges who hear the cases? Who comprises the jury? Unless you guarantee that black people are not being singled out for prosecution, that the judges are not discriminating, and that the juries actually represent a jury of the accused peers and not just a bunch of white people who already just want to put away every black person they can, unless you've done that, then no, there's no such thing as duly convicted. You're just getting railroaded, which of course is the entire point. So slavery never stopped. That's the first thing that we have to get straight here. The peculiar institution has always been around. Maybe it's been a little more peculiar than people expect because they watch a lot of movies and TV. But the effect is exactly the same, which is exactly what was intended. From the chain gangs to the prison industrial complex, slavery never ended. Not because I say so, but because the U.S. government says so. The same government who proposed financial recompense to our ancestors and then immediately broke their word. Now, of course, the white supremacists will try to claim that the 40 acres and a mule was never an act passed by Congress, so it's not binding, etc., etc. Well, in a moment, I'll show you some examples of laws passed by Congress that included black people and which the government still categorically ignored anyway. But even without the 40 acres and a mule, after the Civil War, black people began building. Soon there were black universities, townships, and banks. In many areas, black citizens were financially better off than their white neighbors. Because the federal government had troops in the cities to control the white supremacist mobs, and also the government stood behind the laws meant to prohibit the racists from impeding black political and economic progress. In other words, there was government force behind the laws passed after the Civil War. But that's not to say that the white government liked it. Within the first 5 years after the Civil War, black people had seats in the House of Representatives and even a senator. And that was at the federal level. At the state level, we had far more representation. But what exactly does that mean? What kind of authority did black people have in the post-Civil War period? As I've always said, black empowerment will not come into its own until we have the ability to punish the white supremacists and to exercise control over them. Well, here's an image for you, an engraving from 1878. This engraving is of an African-American constable in Virginia who's flogging a white woman for stealing a pair of shoes. This engraving dates from 1878. I want you to think about that. That's just 13 years after the American Civil War was over. A mere 7 years after the government passed the KKK Act of 1871. And you'll notice that what you have in this image is also a bunch of white men who are standing there watching this. I think it's safe to say that they certainly didn't approve, but by the same token, the law applies equally to everyone at this point. And there are also the federal troops to consider. So if you decide to yourself that maybe you don't like the fact that the law is being applied equally, well, the government's making sure that you're not able to change that. That's what you call justice. And although certainly this was not the case throughout all of the cities and townships and counties and states, the point is the fact that this was even happening for a whole lot of those white supremacists, they were looking and going, hold on, this racial equality thing's going far too far. These Negroes, they literally are the ones holding the whip. And they weren't the only ones who wanted to make sure that this growing black empowerment was stopped immediately, dead in its tracks. While it's true that Southern Democrats hated seeing black people able to compete, it's also true that the Northern Yankee didn't like it either. So starting in 1877, the white Northerners and white Southerners agreed that black progress had to be stopped and that they would work together to make sure that it was stopped. The so-called Compromise of 1877 wasn't forced on the U.S. government. It was agreed to by both the white North and white South to make nice again with each other and reunite under the unifying principle of white supremacy: anti-black racism. The government withdrew federal troops from the South, but more than that, they also refused to enforce the laws that had been passed. That was deliberate. Because although there would certainly be the most brutal expressions of anti-black violence in the South, the North also had its own sundown towns, racial segregation. It was as bad in places as Chicago and Detroit as it was in New Orleans or in Memphis. Moreover than that, now that the government made it very clear this is going to be national policy, it was understood by black people you didn't have anybody to appeal to. The government made it very clear that they were taking sides, and the side that they were on was Team White Supremacy. Laws such as the KKK Act of 1871, which some of you have probably heard of being used in regards to the January 6th insurrectionists, those laws are on the books still used today, and yet they've never been applied for the benefit of black people. The government was a complicit partner in the racial genocides that took place following Reconstruction and proceeded into the early decades of the 20th century. When white supremacist gangs began marauding across the country, destroying black townships, the U.S. government did nothing about it until the Tulsa Massacre, but the government's action in that case was to take sides with the white marauders. U.S. government made sure to back up those white supremacist genocides every time they happened. Either they were actively helping to carry them out, or at the very least saying, well, we're not going to do anything about it. That's complicity. That's the government taking part. And the government's anti-black racist policies didn't stop in the 19th century. World War II was seen as an excellent opportunity to take the racial hierarchy and freeze it in place for at least another 100 years. Take, for instance, the GI Bill. The GI Bill was principally about three things: money for education, money for housing, and money to start a business for the GIs returning from World War II. Black GIs, however, were categorically denied all of these things. And it wasn't just a few of them, it was practically all of them. Now, the white media tries to play this game of, some black veterans were denied GI Bill benefits. That's a lie. Practically all of them were denied benefits. It wasn't just one or two of them. As far as housing went, the GI Bill got the returning white veterans low-interest loans with no money down. And keep in mind, this was back in the 1940s and 50s when houses didn't cost anywhere near what they do today and didn't require as much of your income as they do today. But more than that, the GI Bill's housing provision was specifically written to incentivize the building of new construction. As a bank, if you really wanted for Uncle Sam to cake you off, just make sure that GI is asking for money to build a new home. This was the federal government putting its hand on the scales to make sure that there were going to be a baby boom and a boom in new housing. The first 2 years after the war, 40% of mortgages issued were guaranteed by the Veterans Administration. That's in the first 2 years after the war. 2 out of every 5 homes that had mortgages were being backed up by the Veterans Administration. By 1955, the VA was backing close to a third of housing starts. So 10 years after World War II was over, 30% of new housing was being backed by the federal government's Veterans Administration. But the question is, how many of those went to black people? The answer, practically none. You had redlining being carried out by the U.S. government. They were the ones who oversaw it. But for the white GIs, new subdivisions sprang up overnight. Suddenly you had new towns on the outskirts of the major cities, places called suburbs. This wasn't because millions of people suddenly became rich. The housing boom wasn't because there were all these people who suddenly got educated. The government paid for it. The government bought it for them. And as for black GIs, practically none of them were able to get any of these housing loans, any of these educational loans. They weren't able to get any of these business loans. And just in case a black GI did, the 1 or 2 of them who did manage to get one, no doubt much lower than what a white GI got, or if a black family wanted to move into those suburbs, well, those areas had racial covenants in place that mandated that only white people could live in those areas. And even the places that didn't have openly racial covenants didn't need them because the banks were all on code and systematically denied black GIs housing loans. So for the brain-dead morons who tried the lie that, the free market would certainly address this issue. I mean, the banks would do what's in their self-interest. It's in their interest to write loans. No, there are people who, when it comes to white supremacy, that's more important to them than financial gain. I think it was Eliot Spitzer who said something to the effect of, the need to be able to discriminate against black people is more important to these people than profit motive. So no, I'm afraid it's not about green. It is all about black and white. So the same way that we saw targeted policies aimed at black people in the 19th century to deprive us of what little wealth we were trying to accumulate in the 20th century, they turbocharged it. Understand that the creation of the suburbs and their racial makeup were not accidents. They were planned. They were the result of massive amounts of funding by the federal government, who made sure that black people, whose tax money went to build those white enclaves, would be excluded. The black veterans whose sacrifice won the war were denied the very benefits that their sacrifice made possible. Of course, the same thing went for businesses as well. The Department of Veterans Affairs categorically refused to give loans to black GIs. So if you were a white GI coming back from World War II, you had your education, your home, and your first business all paid for by the federal government. The white middle class was not some natural phenomenon. And no matter what it is that white people in America may say, it was not the result of hard work, dent, and industry. It was handed to them because they were classified as white. This was the result of policy, racial policy, as were the black ghettos. The suburbs and the slums were both an invention of the U.S. government's policies. The suburbs and the yuppies were created out of whole cloth by a federal government who selectively put funds into white people's hands and selectively kept it out of black people's hands. And you had a white media going right along with it, ignoring it if they could, but if that wasn't possible, doing everything they could to justify it. The wealth that we had generated for hundreds of years was confiscated from us and redistributed to everyone except for us. And it happened again in the 20th century. They confiscate our tax dollars and redistribute the wealth that we generate to everyone except for ourselves and make laws prohibiting us to be able to have the benefits of our own earnings. No business loans, no low-interest housing loans, no access to institutions of higher learning. The only policy they had for us was redlining. The banks were merely the administrators of it. The banks were carrying out a government policy, no different than the railroads in the 19th century, who the government gave loans to and helped them get funding by taking out bonds on behalf of those banks. The government were the ones who wanted the railroads. The white bankers and businessmen who owned the rail lines were merely carrying out the government's policy. Now, starting around the late 1960s, basically at the end of the Civil Rights Movement, where there was this idea that all of these rowdy black folks need to be displaced all over again. So we started seeing gentrification, which was being carried out with huge amounts of government money as well. White supremacists whine all the time about the so-called Great Replacement. I don't know about you, but I haven't seen any white people disappearing. That racist who lives up the block from you or works on your job, he hasn't been replaced. He's still the same jerk he always is. He hasn't gone anywhere. That talking point is not the result of any anxiety about what might happen. They're looking at their own behavior and projecting it onto us. There was already a great replacement, and it happened to black people in cities like Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York. As a case study, take the former township of Lenontown, Georgia. You had a black community which, by the 1960s, 60% of the residents owned their own land. But the land was seized by the city of Athens, Georgia, and handed over to the University of Georgia. They basically paid practically nothing for it. The residents didn't get really much of anything for it. Now, the white media will try to claim, well, the city did give them some kind of payment, but what the white media conveniently leaves out is that the money wasn't enough for them to buy a home. They paid them well below fair market value, especially for a site that's about to become a lot more valuable. And considering that this was at a time when houses didn't cost what they do today, you know this was an act of highway robbery. The black families of Lenontown largely wound up either in public housing or having to move out of the city altogether. The single most important material possession necessary for generational wealth is land ownership. That's the single most important one. To take someone's land and then give them a pittance for it, that is to deliberately impoverish them. But the white supremacists in Athens, Georgia and the University of Georgia couldn't have done it alone. Under the federal government's urban renewal program, cities and colleges were empowered to take property in what was called slum clearance. The University of Georgia and the Athens city government simply took lots and then burned them to the ground. This is why way back in We're All Detroiters Now, I was the one who coined the phrase gentrification as ethnic cleansing American style. Please understand that these were not the messy excesses of government policy. These were not the externalities of otherwise race-neutral policies. The forced exodus of black people from the South at the turn of the 19th century and the current forced black flight out of the major cities of the North has been going on unabated for 150 years. This was the plan all along. It wasn't an accident. And this stuff didn't happen merely because the U.S. government was off twiddling its thumbs. It happened because the U.S. government was overseeing it. The U.S. government was carrying this out. So any way you want to slice it, the biggest perpetrators of slavery and the crushing anti-black racism that's followed has been the government at all levels. And we're going to make it clear that we're not accepting any excuses. And we're not accepting any half measures either. You can keep your apologies. We didn't ask for apologies and we don't need it. That's not what we demanded. The only thing you can do for us is what you should have done 500 years ago. Cut the check. Good day and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Mouse, Ricky Davis, Christopher Ellis, Luvinia Lewis, and E. Juice Jones. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.